American cities have quietly spent over $10 billion cutting down perfectly healthy trees lining the streets, shading the sidewalks, holding the soil together, not because of drought, not because of development, because of something smaller than a penny. This is the opening chapter of an asymmetric biological war, one where modern metropolises have been pushed into total financial paralysis, not by a weaponized virus or a natural disaster, but by a beetle that glitters like a jade gemstone, the emerald ash borer. Cities injected expensive chemicals directly into root systems at enormous cost, and it still wasn't enough. That $10 billion tab doesn't reflect victory. It reflects the moment administrators realized their entire defense playbook was written for the wrong enemy, one that operates at the cellular level. Invisible, silent, and already inside the walls. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, the city once had around 18,000 ash trees lining its streets and parks. By the time the outbreak ran its course, roughly 1,300 were still standing. That's not a bad year for the urban forestry department. That's near total collapse. And here's the thing that made it so expensive. Cities couldn't just leave the dead trees where they were. A living ash tree is strong, flexible, and deeply rooted. A dead one is something else entirely. Once the internal system shuts down, the wood dries out fast. And dried out ash doesn't bend, it snaps. A dead ash standing over a sidewalk isn't a tree anymore. It's a loaded structure waiting for the wrong gust of wind. We're talking about trunks coming down on cars, on power lines, on people walking their dogs on a Tuesday morning. Cities had no choice. Every dead tree was a liability, and the clock was ticking on all of them at once. In Fairmont, Minnesota, local officials had to remove around 16,000 trees. The bill came out to nearly $2 million for a single city, not to plant new trees, not to restore anything, just to cut down what was already dead and haul it away. Now you might be wondering, how does a beetle smaller than your thumbnail actually kill something that massive? Because from the outside, those trees looked fine for a long time. The trunk was solid, the bark was intact, there were no obvious wounds, no dramatic signs of rot, just a few tiny D-shaped exit holes, each about the size of a pencil tip. Easy to miss, easy to dismiss. But what was happening underneath that bark was a different story. The larvae weren't chewing through the hard outer wood. That would take too long and cost them too much energy. Instead, they targeted something far more critical: the cambium and phloem. These are the thin layers of living tissue sitting just beneath the bark, and they are, in the most literal sense, the tree's circulatory system. The cambium is where new cells grow. The phloem is the pipeline that moves sugars and nutrients from the leaves down to the roots. The larvae carve shaped galleries through both layers, winding, overlapping channels that cut across the tissue like someone had taken a saw to every major road in a city all at once. The roots were still doing their job. They were still pulling water up from the soil. The leaves were still photosynthesizing, still producing energy. But the delivery system in between had been severed. The upper branches stopped receiving water first. Then they started dying back. Then the leaves thinned out. Photosynthesis dropped. The roots got starved of sugar. And from that point forward, the whole system was in free fall. It happened slowly enough that you might not notice for a season or two. But by the time the crown started visibly dying, the damage inside was already total. And this brings up the part that most people never think about. Why were so many trees hit so hard, all at once, across so many cities? The answer isn't just the beetle. It's the way American cities planted their trees. For decades, urban planners loved ash. It grew fast, handled pollution well, looked clean along a boulevard, and tolerated the brutal conditions of a city sidewalk better than most species. So they planted it everywhere and often exclusively. Drive down a major street in the Midwest, and you might find block after block of nothing but ash. 40% of a city's entire urban canopy made up of a single species. That's not a canopy, that's a monoculture. And a monoculture isn't a forest, it's a buffet with one item on the menu. When the emerald ash borer arrived, it didn't have to search, it just had to land. But here's the part that most people never think about. Where did this beetle actually come from? And how did it end up in the middle of Michigan in the first place? To answer that, you have to rewind to the early 1990s. A cargo shipment arrived from Asia and docked somewhere near Detroit, Michigan. Nobody flagged anything unusual. It was just another routine delivery, wooden shipping pallets. The cheap kind used to stack and move goods across oceans. Standard international trade. Happens millions of times a year. But inside the wood of those pallets made from Eurasian ash, something was hiding. Emerald ash borer larvae. Thousands of them. Maybe millions. Coiled inside the grain of the wood. Invisible from the outside. They had survived the sawmill. They had survived the ocean crossing. And now they were in North America. With no natural predators and an entire continent of ash trees that had never encountered them before. That was the moment the clock started. Nobody knew it at the time. By 2003, the government finally knew something was wrong. Federal quarantine orders went out covering 13 counties across Michigan. Checkpoints appeared on highways. Officials banned the transport of firewood across county lines. Heavy fines for violations. The whole administrative machine spun into action. And none of it made any meaningful difference. Because here's what those quarantine maps couldn't account for. A single mated female emerald ash borer can fly 12 miles a day, every day. For up to 6 weeks straight, you can draw a boundary on paper. You cannot draw one in the air. By the time officials identified an infected zone and organized a response, the beetles had already been gone for seasons. The quarantine line was always chasing something that had moved on 3 to 5 years earlier. It was like trying to contain a wildfire by building a fence around where it used to be. By 2016, the outbreak had crossed into 35 states and 5 Canadian provinces. The map wasn't just red anymore. It was almost entirely red. Cities tried the chemical route. In Kansas City, officials launched a treatment program for 12,000 ash trees, injecting pesticide directly into the root system of each one, at around $80 per tree. And it worked. For about 3 years. Then the treatment wore off, and the trees needed another round, and then another. It wasn't a solution. It was a subscription service for keeping your trees alive, indefinitely, against an enemy that never stops reproducing. The math was brutal. You could protect one tree. You could protect a block of trees, but you couldn't protect a continent of trees this way, and the beetle didn't need a single gap in your coverage to win. It just needed time. That's the hidden variable in this entire story. People blame the beetle's reproductive rate. They blame the gaps in the quarantine. But the real accelerant was something nobody wanted to point a finger at: the global supply chain itself. The same system that moves consumer goods across oceans in 48 hours also moves biological stowaways that no custom scanner was ever designed to detect. The emerald ash borer didn't invade North America because it was especially aggressive or unusually fast. It invaded because we handed it a free ride inside the infrastructure of modern trade, and then spent the next 2 decades trying to catch up. Step away from the cities for a moment. Leave the chainsaw crews and the municipal budgets behind. Because while all of that was happening, something quieter and far more permanent was unfolding out in the forests around the Great Lakes. The timber industry had been watching the numbers climb for years, and they were not good numbers. Every year, more than 100 million board feet of ash lumber was being lost. The finished products made from that wood flooring, furniture, tool handles, baseball bats represented over $25 billion in annual market value. And if you counted all the standing ash timber still alive in the forests, the total value sitting in those trees was estimated at around $280 billion. That's not a rounding error. That's a category of American industry being erased. In some sections of the Great Lakes region, the die-off rate in ash-dominant forest patches exceeded 99%. Not a bad season, not a regional setback. Effectively total extinction at the local level, repeated across thousands of square miles. But the money loss, as staggering as it was, turned out to be the part of the story people could at least count. What they couldn't easily count was what happened next. Ash trees don't exist in isolation. Nearly 100 species of insects had evolved specifically around the ash genus, feeding on its leaves, living inside its bark, completing their life cycles on its branches and roots. When the ash disappeared, those insects had nowhere to go. Some adapted. Most didn't. Localized extinctions quietly rippled outward through the food web, and most people never noticed because there were no headlines about a beetle going extinct. Then came the light. When ash trees die and fall, they tear open the forest canopy. Sunlight that used to be filtered through dense layers of leaves now hits the forest floor directly. And in that warm, exposed soil, something starts growing. fast. The problem is, it's not the right things growing. Invasive plant species, the opportunists, the fast movers, the ones native ecosystems never had to compete with rush in to fill the gap. Shrubs that grow faster than any native seedling, ground cover that smothers everything underneath it. Within a few seasons, a section of forest that lost its ash canopy can look, from a distance, completely green again, and that's the trap. If you drove past one of those recovering patches on a highway in Ohio or Michigan, you might actually feel a little relieved. Look at all that green coming back, if you'd think. Nature is resilient after all, but walk into that forest and pay attention to what's actually there. The insects that native bird species depend on for food, they're not there. The caterpillars, the beetles, the larvae that songbirds need to fuel their bodies before migration gone, because the plants feeding those insects are gone, replaced by species that the local food web simply doesn't recognize. Every autumn, hundreds of millions of birds make the same journey they have made for thousands of years. They follow instinct. They follow magnetic fields. They follow the routes their ancestors flew. But before they can fly south, they need to eat a lot. They need to double their body weight in fat reserves in just a few weeks. And in the forests around the Great Lakes, that fuel is no longer there. Birds that used to land, feed, and refuel on their migration route now find a forest that looks full but feeds nothing. They push on, burning through reserves they never replenished. Some make it, some don't. The ones that don't simply disappear somewhere over open water or open land, with no one to record the moment. A green forest that cannot feed a bird. That's what a 99% ash die-off actually looks like from the inside. But while all of that was falling apart, something unexpected was happening in the same damaged forests. Between 2002 and 2011, researchers tracking bird populations in infested areas noticed a pattern that didn't fit the story of pure devastation. The red-bellied woodpecker population was spiking, not declining, spiking, in areas where ash trees were dying by the thousands. This one species was thriving in a way nobody had predicted. The reason was simple. For a woodpecker, an emerald ash borer infestation isn't a disaster. It's a delivery service. Think about what these birds can do that we can't. Forest rangers and entomologists trying to identify infected trees had to wait until the crown started dying, by which point the larvae had already been tunneling for one, sometimes 2 full seasons. Every detection method humans developed was working from the outside in. Reacting to symptoms that showed up late, a woodpecker works the other way around. It doesn't look for dying trees. It listens for living larvae. Those tiny shaped tunnels are noisy when something is chewing through them. And a woodpecker's hearing is precise enough to pick up that sound through several centimeters of bark. The bird lands, tilts its head, listens for a second or two, and then starts drilling, not randomly, but exactly where the activity is. It pulls the larvae out one by one, fat and protein rich, exactly what a bird needs. No database, no budget request, no 3-year treatment cycle. Just a beak and a pair of ears that evolution spent millions of years calibrating for precisely this task. In documented infestation zones, woodpecker predation was suppressing up to 40% of the beetle population in actively affected areas. 40%. That's not a rounding error, that's a meaningful biological dent, achieved entirely for free, with no side effects, running continuously every single day. And yet, 40% wasn't enough to stop the wave. The beetle reproduced faster than the birds could eat, and when researchers considered the obvious next step, artificially boosting woodpecker populations by building nest boxes or relocating birds into high infestation zones, the idea ran into a wall. Woodpeckers don't exist in a vacuum. They compete for territory and nesting sites with other native cavity nesting birds, brown creepers, water thrushes, newthratches. Flooding an ecosystem with one species to solve a problem caused by another species carries its own cascade of consequences. The forest had been disrupted enough. Forcing a population intervention at that scale risked making a second mess while trying to clean up the first. So the woodpeckers kept doing what they do. Useful, impressive, but not sufficient on their own. The situation needed something the forest didn't already have, a predator that had evolved alongside this specific beetle, on the beetle's own home ground, for thousands of years. And that meant scientists had to go looking somewhere very far from the Great Lakes. So researchers did something that, in hindsight, was obvious, but only once someone thought to ask the right question. If this beetle had been living in Asia for thousands of years, why weren't the forests there being wiped out? The answer was natural enemies. Predators that had co-evolved alongside the beetle kept its population in check and prevented it from ever reaching outbreak levels on its home continent. Scientists traveled to China and Russia, into the beetle's native range, to find them. What they came back with was something most people would walk right past without noticing. Parasitoid wasps. Tiny ones, so small they pose zero threat to humans, no sting, no visible danger. But for an emerald ash borer larva, these wasps are a death sentence delivered from the inside. The method is precise and, depending on your tolerance for biological horror, either fascinating or deeply unsettling. The wasp locates a beetle egg or young larva beneath the bark. It deposits its own egg directly into the host. The wasp larva hatches, feeds, and develops entirely inside the body of the beetle, consuming it from within. By the time the wasp emerges, the beetle is gone. That's not a pesticide. That's a targeted strike. After years of rigorous safety testing to confirm these wasps wouldn't attack native North American insects, the United States Department of Agriculture gave the green light. In 2007, the first release operations began in Michigan and Ohio. Small scale, controlled, monitored at every step. The program kept expanding. By 2020, even as the pandemic disrupted supply chains and research schedules across every other sector, the labs kept producing. More than 550,000 parasitoid wasps had been released across more than 240 infestation sites throughout the country. And then the data from 2021 started coming in. In northeastern states, Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, researchers confirmed something that nobody wanted to predict too confidently. The wasps had established themselves and were spreading on their own. No further human transport required. They were moving into new areas, tracking the beetle, doing what they were built by millions of years of evolution to do. Coverage had expanded to 22 states, in zones where the wasps and woodpeckers were both active, working the same trees, hitting the same populations from different angles. Researchers found something they had barely dared to expect. Late-stage larvae counts on young ash trees dropping to zero, not reduced, zero. $10 billion spent by cities across America could not stop this beetle. Checkpoints, chemicals, quarantine orders, none of it held the line. But a wasp small enough to land on your fingernail, one that evolution had already spent thousands of years engineering for exactly this purpose, is doing what all of that money could not. The lesson isn't that humans failed. The lesson is that we finally stopped trying to solve a biological problem with financial tools and started looking for the solution where it actually lived.